Okay, perfect. Looks like we're recording. Wonderful. So I want to start by saying thank you for inviting myself and Trevor here today from Evidence for Democracy to talk about fact checking. This is something that is quite important to our organization, and I hope that I portray that reason to you throughout. What I will do today is go over a little bit of an explanation and introduction to Evidence for Democracy itself, and then we'll dive right into some tips and tricks on how to be effective fact checkers. I will note that there is a lot of time at the end for questions because I think what Trevor and I are hoping to do towards the end is to familiarize ourselves a little bit with what the process of your fact checking system will be. We've created a bit of a worksheet for your group on that will actually help you fact check in the moment. And so we would like maybe some feedback from you so that we can maybe build out that worksheet a little bit more for you so that it's specialized to maybe what you foresee the roles being on the day of for your event. But I did want to acknowledge that Trevor and I are joining today from Ottawa, and we're really honored to live, work, and play here on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I'll introduce myself quickly. So I am Sarah Laframboise. I am the executive director here at Evidence for Democracy. I'm a very soon to be PhD graduate in biochemistry from the University of Ottawa. I have a long track record in advocacy and was one of the leaders of the Support Our Science campaign, which advocated for increased funding to graduate students and postdocs in Canada. I might let Trevor introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, hope you can hear me and hopefully you're having a good start to the session. So myself, I'm Trevor. I'm the Director of Research and Policy with Evidence for Democracy. I have a long background in government relations in Ottawa. That's kind of my bread and butter, particularly in the post-secondary education sector. And yeah, really happy to get stuck in with you guys.
Awesome. And so if you haven't heard of Evidence for Democracy before, we are a leading nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization that is championing the integration of scientific evidence into government decision-making in Canada. And to do this, we have a bit of a combination of original research that is driving campaigns and is leading to tangible policy outcomes. And we do this a lot through fostering kind of public and political demand for transparent and evidence-informed policies that ultimately kind of have a benefit for society. We spend a lot of time working with researchers and scientists to help them kind of realize their role in democracy alongside us so that we can help bridge that gap between scientists and policymakers. Now, the origin of E4D originated in this event, which took place on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, which was called the Death of Evidence March, led by this very ominous Grim Reaper. But they were protesting at the time in support of the public service scientist community. During this time, about 90% of federal scientists didn't feel like they could speak freely to the media about their work. And so this rally was really in support of combating some of that misinformation that was surrounding the topics at the time. Since then, we've been working to make sure that science is respected by the government and that it has a role to play in policy decisions. So following the Death Evidence March, we saw the election of the Liberal government, and then we had some really significant wins for science. We saw a chief science advisor, we got a scientific integrity policy, we got an appointment of a minister of science and an ISED minister. And so all these things kind of indicated that we were going to be in a different era of science. We also saw the creation of a standing committee for science and research. We had a fundamental science review led by Dr. David Naylor. And E4D has continued to uphold a lot of these tenets through different campaigns, such as our Vote Science campaign, which we are working on right now. And I'll flag to this group because you're located in BC. We're in the process of analyzing the federal or the provincial budgets in BC, or the platform, sorry, for different themes on science and research. And so I'm happy to share a copy of that later on with your group, where you'll be able to go through actually different themes of science and research in each of the platforms for the different political parties in BC. We also do a variety of trainings, such as our Science Policy Accelerator program. It's a great opportunity for early career researchers to get involved in science policy. And then we do original research as well. So this is a variety of our transparency research, our Eyes on Evidence series, where we evaluated both provincial and federal policies on how transparent those policies were and whether people could actually see the evidence. We've done research on analyzing elected officials and things like this, where we can actually go and review any barriers that people have in accessing information from the parliamentary side. We also do a lot of public outreach as well. This is our Evidence Matters campaign, where we created a variety of different guides for people to be able to ask for evidence, demand for difference, and have actually guides and companions to understanding scientific evidence as well. But ultimately, this amalgamates into the overarching kind of theory of change at E4D is that we really believe that when governments make policy decisions that are informed by the best available evidence, this is, we all benefit from this. And I think this is the grounding factor of what we do at E4D. Now, today, we're going to hone in on the purpose of kind of why we were invited here. I know that you all are going into a fact-checking scenario for a local debate. And so we're going to go over a little bit about some key considerations to keep in mind going through this. We're going to talk a little bit about misinformation. We're going to talk about what is fact checking and how you actually do fact checking, some things to consider on a personal level when you're going into these types of situations. And then a bit of a summary, and again, lots of time for questions at the end. I'm really looking forward to being able to help you guys figure out what roles to play during this process, how you divide up some of the information and things like that. So to start, misinformation in politics has become more apparent every day. We're living in a very different technological environment than we were maybe 10 years ago in an election. And so I think it's important to kind of ground this conversation in this. And we'll start by understanding a little bit about what misinformation actually is. So misinformation is essentially categorically false information. Not only is it not true, but it can have very serious effects on the public consciousness, trust, and consensus. And so this often leads to the way that we interact with misinformation, because our beliefs and skepticism can show us what cognitive biases and shortcuts that may be in the way of what we think. So misinformation can be either deliberate or it can be intentional. But in this kind of definition standpoint, we're going to talk about the difference between misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So disinformation is false information that is not intended to cause harm, whereas disinformation is false information that is intended to manipulate, cause damage, or guide people's organizations and or countries in a wrong direction. Malinformation, on the other hand, is information that is actually true, but is often exaggerated in a way that misleads or causes potential harm. And so I think when we're evaluating evidence and a fact, it's important to consider kind of where it sits on this, because the level of falseness and the level of intent to harm is important factors in this process, so that you kind of know what the intent was for that information. This information can look very different, and it can present in many different ways. We've thrown a bunch of examples here. We still see misinformation regularly in print media, online and social media, through mainstream media. It's sometimes patently false. This can be, like a celebrity kind of news section where things are going to be, deliberately kind of false and clickbaity. It can sometimes be misrepresented, or outdated information can also be included in this. You'll often see this in cases where they're citing information that is very old to prove a point, when in reality, the information that we know now is much different than what we knew back then. It can also be positive or negative. Not all misinformation has like malicious intent or has a negative connotation. It could be that it's a baseless claim about something that is actually positive as well. It also falls on all sides of the political spectrum. This is, no one is immune to misinformation, and it happens to any political leader, no matter which kind of political party that they're on. And on a personal level, we all are inherently very vulnerable to misinformation, especially in the landscape that we digest information on right now. Social media has completely changed the way that we understand information and receive news. And so I think that understanding kind of how misinformation spreads is also really important. So I've pulled up this chart here, and it's just kind of showing that misinformation can come from people of power. So this looked at the whether misinformation was being spread by people of power and how much engagement that then took. So what this is showing is that only 20% of total misinformation is shared by political leaders, but the engagement that they get on it makes it up to 70% of the total engagement in content on social media platforms. And so I think that this shows that it can be both top down and bottom up. This is basically saying, where is information originating and how much is it being amplified? So misinformation coming from these people of power tends to be more readily shared and engaged with from the community. At E4D, we have stopped using the term fake news. This is an important kind of point here too, is fake news is kind of a catch-all for various kinds of misinformation like bots, misleading political statements, reporting errors, and we often lose nuance when we use phrases like this. And it ends up kind of being more harmful than helpful. So the phrase is often used by previous President Trump and his supporters, and it becomes detrimental. So because we use this term, it kind of perpetuates that narrative that the far right is claiming that mainstream media is lying. And so the connotation of that term automatically begins to imply that mainstream media can't be trusted. So us using that phrase not only kind of adds validity and support to that claim, but it also, isn't our intention when we say it. So if we are intending to say it for different purposes, it's kind of mute because it already has that connotation publicly. Now, while misinformation spreading can seem like it's more of a personal struggle or a personal challenge, it's also important to note that misinformation has a variety of different impacts. So this can impact you on a social level, on a community level, or an individual level. At the individual level, this can be, illness and death from harmful products or preventable diseases. We saw this during COVID when President Trump at the time was suggesting that people should take ivermectin as a treatment for COVID. This was a serious drug that people were taking for the wrong reasons. And so it led to preventable diseases and injury to people who were taking it. It's also wasted money on disproven products and services. So, the healthcare or the health industry is often a huge source of misinformation. All of these miracle weight loss tools and things like this often lead to a bunch of things that are being sold, and people are profiting off of this. On a community level, we see lower compliance with public health advice, outbreaks of vaccine for preventable diseases, increase in healthcare system use and cost. And I'll get into an example on vaccine hesitancy in a second and explain exactly kind of how that is working. On societal level, we see increased political polarization. The spreading of misinformation leads to very polarizing conversations, and that really creates this divide between political parties that are already very large, but it kind of perpetuates them by kind of putting these us versus them combative type terms into the conversation. It diminishes public trust as well. Even right now, I'm sure if you were to talk to a loved one about misinformation, one of the number one things that they will say is that they don't know where to go for information, especially with the changes to the social media platforms, which are no longer able to share news stories in Canada. No one really knows where to go to for reliable news that is not biased. Inaction on climate change is also a societal impact. We've seen a lot of misinformation surrounding the climate narrative in Canada. This is leading to ultimately stagnation on this topic from the political standpoint. We can't have action because there's a lot of opposing views and theories. And so this ultimately leads to a standstill where you'll get inaction. Further costs here are, spreadings of wildfires, xenophobic violence. We have distrust in institutions, increase in public fear and anxiety, and a breakdown of the overall public order. Now, I'd like to give an example here on the cost of vaccine hesitancy itself. So this is a study done by the Canadian Council of Academies, where they actually were able to predict or estimate between March and November of 2021. Misinformation contributed to vaccine hesitancy during this time in about 2.35 million people in Canada. So if those people who believed that COVID was a hoax or that it was exaggerated had not delayed or refused their vaccinations, then by the end of November 2021, there could have been 193,000 fewer COVID cases, 13,000 fewer hospitalizations, and 3,500 fewer ICU patients. We would have seen almost 3,000 fewer deaths, and overall, this would have saved about $300 million in healthcare costs. This is substantial, and this is only over a few months' time. And so I think this just illustrates really well why spreading misinformation is so harmful to society. Another example is wildfire management. So in 2023, we saw a spread of wildfires in northern Canada around the Yukon, and it spread everywhere at that point. But at the point, there was this narrative of a conspiracy theory surrounding the idea that the government had started these fires. We saw prominent hockey player Theo Fleury in response to a post from True North, where they said, this is actually being caused by Trudeau, and this is all inherently this big conspiracy theory. We saw then too, Maxime Bernier, he put, a good portion of these wildfires raging across the country were started by green terrorists who want to give their climate change campaign a little boost. This is really harmful misinformation that is, suggesting that our own government started these wildfires. Now, this might seem like it was just a conspiracy theory that stayed on the internet. Unfortunately, this wasn't true. Misinformation surrounding the wildfires actually caused a huge disruption in access to emergency services. At that point, there was, I think it was the beginning of the Meta blockade on social media. And so residents of Yellowknife actually were not able to access reliable information about where the fires were, or figure out when they needed to evacuate the area because of this. So the blockade really impacted their ability to know and keep themselves safe. There was also a decision to reload firefighters at one point, and this was because of a spread of information online that suggested that the Freedom Convoy was actually going to go and set up a blockade surrounding the areas of the fire to block the firefighters from going to that area in a direct route. And so they ended up having to go and relocate the firefighters to a different location. The confusion for the residents. There was also, real cases of arson that came out of this. And this is a really concerning side of this, was that there was a man in Quebec who posted these conspiracy theories online about how the government had started these fires. And he actually ended up going and starting 14 different fires in Quebec in order to prove this narrative to his followers that the government was starting these fires. This tweet here is an interesting one where the mayor of Yellowhead actually went to the local hockey arena and told his community and pleaded to them to please stop spreading gossip and misinformation surrounding the wildfires that was happening in that community. And we did even see narratives of this fall into the House of Commons. There's a viral video online where one of the Liberal MPs is talking about the wildfire damage, and you can hear people behind them saying that, like, oh, well, the Liberal Party started the fires anyway. So it really perpetuated into this expansive conspiracy theory that made its way all the way to the House of Commons. So how do we address misinformation? That's why you're all here today. You're gonna get a deep dive into what fact checking is and how this can play a role in combating misinformation. And so I'll pass it over to Trevor to take that part on.
Perfect. So we'll cover very briefly what fact checking looks like, and in the context of BC in particular, how you guys can apply it to your own work. So when we're looking at fact checking itself is a matter of looking at, or so a process of looking at and assessing the factual accuracy of a statement or claim. Really, that's what it comes down to, the elements of looking at and verifying whether this is based on evidence or whether it's not. So a good example is we've seen last week, John Rustad, the BC Conservative leader, mentioned about the policy announcement from the Premier that the policy itself was looking at, as he put it, handing out free crack pipes. So these idea that it's handing out drug paraphernalia, that it's encouraging what he calls drug dens. When you're looking at fact checking for a statement like this, it's important to get into this, but looking at primary resources and going to the announcement itself, going to the coverage of the announcements, and determining what the elements of that statement, whether they're verifiable. In this case, they weren't. So fact checking really looks at this in terms of whether the statement is false or true. So when it comes to fact checking itself, there are certain elements that you need to consider, in particular, that it's not a end-all be-all solution. Tim Caulfield, on the next slide, is an expert coming out of University of Alberta, looked at, in particular, how fact-checking sometimes it doesn't go right. Keeping in mind that when we're looking at misinformation, often this is emotionally charged, highly inflammatory. It can often really entrench itself into people's beliefs and, lead to persisting biases. So one thing to keep in mind is that context, that often you can use facts to correct misbeliefs, misinformation, but often it can still persist in terms of long-term biases. And we see this in what's called the backfire effect, which is essentially, while it's a rare phenomenon, it's the idea that fact-checking and facts that correct a case of information actually make the belief even more entrenched. So just keeping in mind that sometimes fact-checking isn't, it has its limitations. A couple things to keep in mind when you're fact-checking and you're debunking statements that aren't necessarily in line with evidence, keeping them simple, keeping them clear, avoiding aggressive tones. Again, a lot of misinformation can be emotionally charged and people can take that very personally. So again, keeping in mind that when you're addressing this information, you're not necessarily targeting specific entrenched believers. It's looking at this from the public good, that your audience is the general public, and that the purpose is to improve the public welfare, in particular, correcting cases of misinformation. In cases where misinformation is corrected too late, a really good example is the Lancet article that erroneously made the association between autism and MMR vaccines. This was later retroactively removed from the Lancet journal, but again, the damage was done. We saw in London in particular, MMR vaccination from 91.6% go down to 60%. And again, 2008, England in particular had the first time in 2 decades, had an epidemic for measles. So again, long-term consequences to misinformation, even when it's retroactively debunked. So just things to consider, just how important it is to address misinformation. So now, when you're looking at the process of fact-checking in the context of BC, there's a couple things to consider. Now, again, these are not be-all, end-all. These are some general points to follow. Given the politically charged and often emotionally charged nature of misinformation, it's good to prime your audience with initial warnings. What we kind of mean by that is, as they're going into debate, they're looking at this from an open mind. It's good when you're fact checking to, keep the audience in mind with initial warnings. You're priming the audience to understand that they should look at what is being said and stated from a critical mindset, so that they're primed to the case that there may be misinformation. Again, often how residual and long-term misinformation can be. Repetition is very important. So again, understanding when you're correcting misinformation, it always helps to reiterate your points, to continually and repetitively, address where misinformation is entrenched for too long. It's also important when you're replacing misinformation, you're leaving a gap behind in the audience's mind. And your explanation of what the evidence says needs to effectively fit in to that gap, so that, the audience's worldview isn't thrown off kilter. It's really good to keep in mind your public audience is coming into these debates, again, with a certain worldview. It's important to, when you're addressing misinformation from a fact-checking perspective, that you're at least mindful of what are the worldviews that exist, and how is this fact checking phrased and delivered in a way that it can be readily accepted. And last thing is, of course, keeping your message simple. We're simple creatures by habit. It's much easier to accept a simple explanation than a complex breakdown of all the different factors. Be as simple as you can. So your role as a fact checker, for you guys, this is going to be looking at essentially one main purpose, is to determine whether a claim or statement is made that is either rooted in evidence or not. So always a good question to ask yourself is this statement verifiable? So when you're fact checking, again, keeping in mind that we're nonpartisan, this means no bias, no particular affiliation towards a certain political party, making sure you keep your personal opinions, you check them at the door. Again, because we're looking at this from the simple goal to determine whether a claim or statement is rooted in evidence. A really good distinction that it's important to keep in mind is, again, looking at this from a fact. What's a fact and what's an opinion? Because it's not as black and white as you would think. A fact itself, really, when it comes down to it, is a statement that can be verified. So this is proven true or false through objective evidence. So a body of information that confirms or verifies is a fact. In contrast, when you're looking at this from the perspective of an opinion, these often express, feelings, beliefs, emotions, not necessarily living in a true or false or verifiable space. And often you get scenarios where politicians may frame their opinion as a fact, or, raise some information and propose it as a fact. So knowing, one, the distinction between these two, and when they can kind of masquerade, particularly opinions masquerading as facts. It's very important for you to look into that. And here's a really good breakdown of essentially what that looks like. Again, when it's taken from the perspective of the audience, the fact itself is a statement that's objective. It's often impersonal and not necessarily connected with the audience. Whereas an opinion often will appeal to the subjective, to the personal emotions of an audience. Again, we talked about verifiability. Facts can be demonstrated to be supported by objective evidence, whereas opinions don't live in that same realm. So you'll often see with facts, measurable statistics, dates, data, measurements, things that you can objectively confirm. Often you'll see with opinions, particularly politicians will often use descriptive adjectives, so words that, describe the best, the most, to kind of substantiate their opinion and present it more as acceptable. So Again, keeping in mind for your role as fact checkers, being mindful of real-time fact checking versus follow-up. Real-time is understanding in particular that there are certain limitations that you have, in particular with what time you have. So there's some common tips and tricks that we use. Again, this is not exhaustive, but some good tips that you can use when you're real-time fact checking. So often when you're in the role of a fact checker, there are members of your team that have different responsibilities. Sometimes you have one person that's taking in the statement, you have another person that's analyzing it, checking resources. You may have another person that's relaying that information to the moderator. So again, knowing who your teammates are, what their roles are in this will make your collective fact-checking team a much more efficient machine. Again, prioritizing and triaging what comes up. So keeping in mind that you have a certain, misinformation can spread quickly. It's best to be as time effective as possible. So understanding you prioritize what's the most applicable element to fact check. What is the most crucial element that I should be addressing? Understanding that those elements. Third thing is often having a live fact checking document is a good resource for your team. You can share information, you can put updates. Again, like I mentioned, you can put statements in, you can have someone checking relevant data, you can have an assessment, and that information can all reside in one document. And of course, knowing where to look. We'll get into that in just a sec, but it's very important to be prepared as you're coming into these, where you can look for, let's say, you're fact checking on climate, having an idea where to look. So as I kind of mentioned, it's a good idea to know where to look, and in particular, grading your different sources of information. Of course, there's primary sources. These are original or primary sources that deliver information directly from the source. So these can be, documents, research. This can be a minister's statement online. This can be mandate letters. Again, keeping in mind, this is kind of the gold standard you want to aim for. Secondary sources are not necessarily direct from source. These are often created by another indirectly that has not been actively involved in, let's say, the event or the press conference, let's say. So keeping in mind that secondary sources, while they can be useful, just keeping in mind because there's a disconnect from the direct event or direct source, they can often be misinterpreted. There can be a political bias. So just keeping in mind, you want to aim for primary sources. A couple of resources you want to avoid, again, politically charged news sources, emotionally charged social media posts, where partisanship and where, tabloids, a lot of these elements had a certain bias already injected into them. It's good to steer clear if you can from these resources, and instead look to some resources we have here. You can, once we share the slide deck with you guys, you can take a look. We've got in particular some fact-checking organizations. AFP Fact Check is a really good Canadian resource you can look to. There's also some more niche areas if you want to look at climate, for example. SciCheck, Climate Feedback are some really good areas to look. So you may be, depending on what your team's capacity is, you can even prime yourself by having a couple tabs open on your computer while you're fact checking, so you know where to look. And again, fact checking involves multiple factors. This is something Sarah will go through when talking about what areas to address and what factors are involved in fact checking.
Thanks, Trevor. So I think it's really important when you're going into a fact-checking experience to be really open-minded. The biggest concern that we have with fact-checking procedures is that usually it's very easy to kind of go in with your own personal biases and experiences at the table. But I think, as Trevor illustrated, it's really important to consider that fact-checking is extremely neutral, and it's all about is this piece of evidence or is this statement verifiable? Can it be backed up by evidence? So when you're doing this, always remember to challenge the information and not the person. And this is like rule number one about being nonpartisan is to, when you're mentioning a fact, it is the policy that you were talking about. You're not saying so-and-so was wrong. You're saying the statement they made or the claim they made was incorrect. And I think that distinction is where you'll be able to be nonpartisan in that. Remember to give them an out. Our brains don't like to be wrong. And to keep the broader audience in mind. I think this was a really important note that Trevor brought up was that, you're not trying to convince someone that what they believe is wrong. You're trying to convince the general public that this fact check was either true, false, mostly true, anywhere and anywhere in between. Now, perceptions are something that we talk a lot about at E4D. One example that I love to use for the power of perception is the classic Dressgate viral picture online. If you guys want to tell me what color you think that this is in the chat, I'd be all ears because it changes every time that I present this. I feel like sometimes I'm convinced that I only see it the one way, and then everyone else always sees it another color. Okay, Anne sees it as blue. That's great. It's always white and gold to me. So, okay, white and blue. We got a blue and black, blue and black, blue and black. Okay. So what I love about this picture is that it is meant to be deceiving. So the photo itself is actually made to be ambiguous to your eyes. And the reasoning there is that if you see the image, and the middle one is the normal photo, it is, in some dark background, it's deceptively kind of shady. And so your eyes actually have visual priors called your rods and cones that are able to go through and actually figure out, is this, black and blue, or sorry, black and blue, or white and gold. And so you actually use the visual priors that you have in your brain to figure that out and to interpret this image. If you tend to spend more time outside, your visual priors have lighter connotations. And so they will actually interpret this image as lighter and it will be white and gold. If you tend to spend more time indoors and often looking at computer screens, then you tend to interpret this a bit darker and it will be blue and black. And so I think this is just such a great example of physical perception. But if you can extrapolate this for a moment, we also have perception of a variety of different issues. Think of any polarizing issue that and people have reasons and and experiences that have made them believe in something a certain way. Vaccine hesitancy is one that I think is a really great example here, where some people have very adverse reactions to vaccines, and that is a real phenomenon. I know myself as a child, I was very, very scared of needles, and that made me very scared of vaccines as an adult. It's, a scary process for a lot of people, but, not everyone has that experience. Some people can go and get the vaccine and it's totally fine. And I think showing that there's variations in life experience that is leading to a belief system as an adult that is then, perceiving the world differently than the people around you. And if this is interesting to you, I would recommend to read David McRaney's book on how minds change. He is all about how perception makes you susceptible to change and to have your mind change, essentially. And he does a really big deep dive into folks who believe in flat Earth and things like this, like some very hardcore conspiracies. And he goes into why this is. So we are a group of scientists. We often have a different worldview in the same way, right? So if we're comparing ourselves to the policy space, so some of the elected officials or candidates that you will be fact checking, it's important to figure out what are the differences in ideology and priorities between myself as a scientist and the politician that I am going to be fact checking. One that is most prominent is the idea of timelines. So scientists often have very long timelines. Policymakers are very short. Again, their tenure is only about 30 months. They're elected into that position for a set amount of time, whereas scientists is a lifelong profession. Your timelines are totally different, and so your perception of time is totally different as well. Language and lexicon, in science, we really like to be very precise and accurate with our statements. We tend to fact check ourselves in the moment and make sure that what we're saying is actually true. We hate absolutes. We tend to talk in a bit more like we don't want to say like X for sure equals Y because that means something. A politician, on the other hand, is more likely to have a lot of flexibility with these types of language. They will say X equals Y, even if it doesn't all the time. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they are, trying to spread misinformation or fake news. They are just that terminology means something different to them than it does to a scientist. Uncertainty, scientists are often quite tolerant to uncertainty, but policymakers have a lot of discomfort surrounding that. They like to know return on investments and things like that with absolute certainty before committing to a solution. If you look down, scientists really like to be specialists, whereas policymakers are generalists. They have to know a lot of portfolios and they can't really, or they don't have time to be a specialist at one thing. Transparency as well, scientists typically believe that things should be quite open. We believe in open publication policies and things like this, whereas policymakers tend to be more closed off. They feel like the public doesn't have to know everything. Now, government decisions themselves are really complex. Decisions don't happen in a vacuum. And I think that we have this perception that sometimes we feel like if I tell you a piece of information, it will change your behavior and you will act accordingly. And this is kind of an outdated science communication model called a knowledge deficit model. If we extend this to a policy, we also might be tempted to think that if I have a piece of evidence, the policy should 100% at all times be created into a policy solution. But this is not true. And this is because policy decisions are very complex and take on a lot of different types of evidence. Science evidence is only one type of evidence, and it's really just counsel to be taken or ignored. And this is why it's up to the policymaker to gather, synthesize, and make sense of the constantly evolving information that is coming from all these different sources. We have, social, economic, legal, health related. These are all different types of evidence that are going into the creation of a policy. Now, even more complex is that we don't just have one policymaker. We have a bunch of policymakers at different levels of government, and they all are getting different inputs of evidence at all times. And so this is why at E4D, we've started to move away from using the term evidence-based, and we instead are using the term evidence-informed. And this is really an acknowledgement that scientific evidence is only one component that informs the government policies, and that this is more of a holistic focus where we want the policy to be informed by the best available evidence. What I'll note too is this is, a really big call out for informed voter decisions. When we put the onus on the policy maker, who is the one who is capturing and integrating all that information, we then have more accountability on an individual level to vote and elect people who we trust to make these decisions for us. That is essentially the underlying elements of our democracy. So I think when we look at it this way, it's more holistic, taking into account the complexities of democracy. In an evidence-based scenario, the evidence or the policy would be completely informed by that piece of science. It has a bit more of a narrow focus. An example that I like to give on this is school closures during COVID. During the pandemic, we 100% knew that the science was saying that we needed our schools to remain closed in order to combat the spread of the COVID virus. What we also knew was that there was a lot of social implications for keeping our kids at home, such as mental health. There was economic concerns for that. And so there was other types of evidence that needed to go into that decision-making process. And this is ultimately what led to policies to open schools back up and put kids back in school. So, if that decision was made solely on the evidence, it would have been a different solution. And so, just gives you an example of understanding the different complexities that go into those types of decisions. So in summary, I hope that we've kind of illustrated a little bit about how misinformation can have devastating consequences. We've also talked a lot about the difference between facts and opinions. So facts are objective statements that can be verified through objective evidence, whereas opinions are subjective statements that express beliefs, attitudes, and feelings. Fact checking then is going to be a tool that can address misinformation in political contexts. And ultimately, fact checking is a public service that then benefits all. And so I think what we'll go into now is a bit of the process of fact checking that Trevor and I have put together for you. So if we can go through a bit of a process here when you are walking into the room to start your fact checking, I hope that I've kind of expressed enough today about how important it is to check your own emotions and personal biases when you're going into this. When you're in the moment and you're hearing a politician say a statement, you should always write out the claim first in its statement form, and then determine if this was expressed as a fact or opinion. Not included here is going to be also how you're going to prioritize this. So we're not saying that you should necessarily write out all of the claims. At some point in this process, it's going to be important for you guys to decide as a team how you want to actually decide which facts to check in the moment. Also, so from that point, if you've expressed whether it's an opinion or a fact, you can then go and start finding primary literature. So look for the original story or the fact, check if the author is from a reliable source and that it's a legitimate source. If you're unsure, one trick that we like to use is to search for that statement with hoax or scam. And sometimes you might catch another fact-checking website that's already kind of tracked something like this or a similar theme. And then if you're still unsure, you can look to see if there's contradicting evidence. Instead of saying X equals Y and you're Googling that, you could say X does not equal Y and try to see if you find evidence on that topic. And then you'll make your final assessment. So what this will look like, and I've shared this in the chat already, but I think at this point, Trevor and I would love to actually start chatting a little bit with you folks about what this process is going to look like for you so that we can explain it. But this is the worksheet that we've put together for you. You can see here where you'll start putting a statement in, the person who made the claim, is this a fact or an opinion? You'll see here some of the examples are opinions portrayed as facts. And then you'll put what does the evidence say here. And this is where you're going to look for your primary literature, verify or disprove this claim. And then we have a rating system that is based off of the PolitiFact website, which is a standard for fact checking, where you can then go through and click on the different rating systems. But Trevor, did you want to add anything to this part?
Yeah, I would just say, so I dropped the link in there. You guys can take a look and see. Again, this is just a template idea. If you're sharing a document between a group of fact checkers, something like this is useful. You can put the statement in. Again, we can kind of walk through this and how we perceive it. But again, this is just one way of looking at fact checking from the approach of a group document where you can triage priorities, you can identify what's factual, from mostly true to false to all these different categories. So again, feel free to explore it. You can make a copy if you want to create your own version. We can go through this in more detail if that's useful for you guys.
Yeah, this is a copy of it here. Yeah, I don't know, Doug or Anne, I might ask for your guidance on maybe what would be most helpful on this front, if this is something that you wanted us to build out with you guys right now, or if you feel